I actually do teach a course at Arizona State University, which is called Science Fiction, Philosophy, Religion, and Technology. So, this book, and so the first book I wrote was called The Simulation Hypothesis, and I wrote it back in 2019 as a first edition, and it went on to, achieve a decent amount of success. But just this summer, I've published a second edition from Penguin Random House, which is the new hardcover edition. And so that one has been greatly expanded. So in a sense, even though Simulation Hypothesis was the first book, it's now become sort of the second or third book in the series because it's the newest one now. One of the ways that I came to write this book was because I was in Silicon Valley as a video game designer, as an entrepreneur, and then later as an investor in video game companies. And I visited one of those companies, and they had a virtual reality ping pong game. And so I put on this VR headset and I was playing, virtual reality table tennis. And what happened was, first of all, it was a big, bulky headset. We used to call it a toaster on your face. And there were wires coming from the ceiling. So today's VR is already much better than this VR was. But at the same time, the physics engine was so good and the responsiveness was so good that when I moved my hand to a certain point, it really felt like I was hitting a ball, and the physics of the ball were such that it fooled my body for an instant into thinking that this was a real game of table tennis. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table. And so the controller fell to the floor. I almost fell over because there was no table to lean on. And that's what made me start thinking, how long would it take us to build something that was so immersive that you would forget that you weren't in the real world? Basically, how long would it take us to build something like the Matrix? And as I looked at the stages to get to that point and how technology might evolve, I also started to look into different aspects of science, religion, and philosophy. And I found that in science, they were telling us something similar, that the physical world isn't really physical as we think of it, that it really consists of bits of information, and that information gets rendered for us in some way. And then when I went back to look at the different religious traditions, I found that many of them were saying the same things. Now, the book subtitle says Eastern mystics, but I found wasn't just Eastern mystics, it was Eastern and Western mystics were all telling us that the physical world isn't real. It's a kind of a hoax or a kind of an illusion. And when I went back and looked at terms like Maya from Sanskrit and the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, they talk that the world is Maya, it's an illusion. Well, they actually talk about it as it's a kind of carefully crafted illusion, one that you immerse yourself in. In a sense, it's as if you're playing a game. They even have a term, the Leela, which is the play, the gameplay of the gods, to describe this process of incarnating and then going through all of these different adventures. And it turns out, similar ideas were present in the biblical and the Judeo-Christian Islamic, the Abrahamic traditions. And in the Quran, for example, they have this idea that the world is El Garuri Matau, and that means a delusion, but not just a delusion, but an enjoyable delusion. And when they say enjoyable, it doesn't mean it's always good or fun, but that to me, what it represented was that most of the world's religions start when a mystic of some kind has an experience. That could be what's called a theophany by religious scholars, where some element of the divine breaks into the physical world, the here versus the hereafter, or it could be through meditation exercises, yogic techniques, etc., that a person is able to perceive or peek outside of the world. And then they come back and they have to explain these ideas to the rest of humanity at that time. And so they have to use metaphors. And those metaphors have to make sense, based on the technological advancement of the society. And so what do? They end up using technological metaphors. For example, the wheel of samsara. Okay, the wheel is actually a technology. If you think about it, it's probably one of the most important technologies ever invented. But they use a technology metaphor to try to describe something that's very difficult for people to comprehend. And so I found that these metaphors, if we were to take them seriously, but not necessarily literally. I mean, they don't literally mean there's a wheel. They're using it to describe something. And like the Book of Life in Christianity and Judaism, and the Scroll of Deeds in Islam. where you have these two angels and they're writing down your good deeds and your bad deeds, and then you have to read the book when you die, and then that determines, where you go afterwards. And so all of these things I looked at and I said, well, these angels don't sound like real entities. They sound like computer processes that are basically recording everything that you do and then replaying it for you. And so I realized that these were just metaphors, and that if we brought those metaphors up to date, we would use new metaphors to try to describe this idea that the world isn't real, that it's a kind of a hoax, it's a kind of a play. As Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and the men and the women are merely players. And so it turns out that one of the mystics that I studied was a guy named Swami Yogananda. And he wrote a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, which was one of the most popular books on yoga and meditation in the West. In fact, in the 1960s and 70s, during the hippies counterculture generation, it was one of the most passed around books of the era, and it was Steve Jobs' favorite book, and it was the only book on his iPad when he died, and they gave it away copies at his memorial service. And so Swami Yogananda came over from India to the West in 1920, and he also tried to update the old metaphors for Maya and illusion, and he said, you know, the physical world is like a movie projected onto a screen, and there's actors in there, and there's characters, and the characters are suffering, and the characters die, but the actors don't necessarily die. And he encouraged his students of yoga and meditation to look away from the screen and look towards the light that was doing the projection. But I believe if he were alive today, he would update the metaphor yet again, because remember, he was using the latest technology of the 1920s. He would say that it's like a movie. We're all actors. We have characters, we have scripts, but we're also the audience. We're watching it, and we're also changing our scripts as we go. And what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And so I found that the video game metaphor, you can take it literally in terms of, is the world based on information, looking at quantum physics and computation, or you can look at metaphorically for what the religious scriptures have been trying to tell us, and the mystics in particular from the different religions have been trying to tell us about the world. It's a new way to express it, but it's probably the best way we've come up with so far. So I wrote another book called The Simulated Multiverse. And what happened was, so the first book was all about why the physical world isn't what we think it is. Space isn't real. It's actually based on bits of information, and it's virtual. One thought that kind of stuck with me after I wrote that book was, well, if whoever created the simulation can create one simulation, there's no reason they couldn't create multiple simulations. And in fact, if you think of the word simulation, when you run a simulation, so let's say you're running a simulation of, say, the spread of a virus, or say of, inflation across, different monetary policy or whatever, or, the path of a comet. What you typically do is you try to put in some initial conditions and you run the process to see what happens. Then you go back and you change those parameters and you see what would happen and you run it again. So you basically try to run multiple simulations. And so when I looked again at quantum mechanics, I realized, one of the most popular interpretations of quantum mechanics and the observer effect is the multiverse idea, which is that every time there's a decision to be made, the universe splits into multiple universes. And this idea has become popular recently because of the superhero movies, like the Spider-Man movies and the DC Comics world with different Superman and different Batman. So it's a good storytelling tool, but at the same time, it's also a pretty serious uh, scientific concept that many physicists actually ascribe to. Now, the problem with the multiverse idea is that you're creating all these universes, and that just doesn't seem very efficient. It doesn't seem very parsimonious. And so one of the insights that I had actually in the simulation hypothesis itself was that if you were to simulate these universes, that is actually much more understandable, because then you're just trying each particular change of parameter. You're running the simulation forward and you're coming back and you're running again. And so, I end up writing this book about this idea that perhaps it's not an infinite multiverse, it's actually computer programs. And when we talk about another universe, what we're really talking about is just another run of the same program. Now, when I was writing the first book, the simulation hypothesis, I interviewed the wife of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. And I did that because Philip K. Dick had given a speech in Metz, France in 1977 with a quote that was pretty well known. And the quote was, "We are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed. Some alteration occurs in our reality." And she said that he came to believe that there were actually multiple timelines in the world. He wrote a book called The Man in the High Castle, which is about an alternate timeline where Germany and Japan won World War II, and then they split America between them. It's a great Amazon series. His work also inspired the Wachowskis who made The Matrix as well. And so when I looked into it, I realized what he was really talking about in that speech was this idea that we could run multiple versions of reality. In fact, the next lines in that speech are, we would have the sense of replaying the same events, speaking the same words. We would have a sense of deja vu. And all we would need to do is find a group of people that remembered a different alternate past to the present. And of course, that wasn't so easy to do back in the pre-internet days. But there's a phenomenon called the Mandela effect now, where people remember a different history. They remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison, and turns out there's all kinds of Mandela effects. Now, whether that's just bad memory or those are actually different timelines is an interesting issue, but I used it as an example to show that when you have a simulated multiverse, you can have not just multiple possible futures, you can also have multiple possible pasts.